My name is Kushla Hill, and I'm the Senior Paintings Conservator for the Grimwade Centre at the University of Melbourne. So I'm speaking to you today from Wurundjeri land, and I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So today I'm presenting on an early work of Australian artist Hugh Ramsay, entitled Portrait of Harley Griffiths on Sorrento Beach, painted when he was still a student during a summer sojourn to Sorrento Beach with fellow National Gallery School students. And the slide shows the work following conservation. So this is the unframed image. It's just a small painting. The dimensions, the unframed dimensions, are about 30 by 38 centimetres. It's just a quick figure study, really, of a young man with rolled up shirt sleeves, turned up trousers, seemingly basking in the hot summer sun on a beach. The painting only required minimal treatment, varnish removal, infilling and in-painting, including adjusting the discoloured overpaint, and a small frame repair. It's a pretty standard practice in the Paintings and Frames lab at the Grimwade. The image in the slide shows the varnish removal in progress. I used a benzyl alcohol xanthan gum methodology, but in the treatment, I didn't remove all the overpaint scattered throughout the work. And you'll see some examples in the following slide of this overpaint, as I was aware that the previous restoration was historically significant because it had been carried out by the son of the sitter many years later. So the slide shows some of the before treatment issues I encountered. It was pretty stable as it had been mariflaged onto a board, evidenced by a pencil and cutting line along the left-hand side. Prior to this treatment, it appears that it had a bit of a rough time. There were several creases in the support and subsequent cracking of the paint, with overpainted losses from a previous restoration campaign, including these quite strange little square forms that are painted over the cracking in the top left corner. Additionally, there were many grains of sands embedded on the surface, as you can see in the detailed image on the right-hand part of the slide. And I'm not sure whether this is due to a gust of wind at the beach setting, or whether it was actually an intention of Hugh Ramsay. The work also presented as having an extensive dirt layer, a yellowed varnish and staining. And this is my little cleaning test up in the top left-hand corner, and a detail of it in the top left of the slide. What I really want to emphasize today is not the treatment process, but the absolute privilege of having such works temporarily in our care, and how we are party to the personal stories of the client regarding the provenance in history of their artwork. And sometimes our research is able to add further to the art historical lexicon. So the background to this work coming into the lab is that it was bought by a young man who is the owner, who had inherited it from his great-grandfather, a Mr. Percy Thompson. The painting was unsigned and undated, with only the remnants of an inscription on the verso in what appeared to be Ramsay's hand. The owner provided the title and the artist information from his family's oral history. So on first viewing the painting, it was immediately obvious whose hand had painted it. There are several Ramsay works in the University of Melbourne collections, including his successful student figure studies. The Grimwade also carried out a Ramsay project in the early 2000s, examining and treating several works prior to their donation to various regional galleries by the Ramsay estate. So I know his work pretty well. There's also been a lot of scholarship on Ramsay over the last 50 years. His artistic talent was heralded early, really from his early student days, and right up until his untimely early death from tuberculosis in 1906. Much has been written about Ramsay as the painter's painter, and I certainly recognize his ability to capture the figure and their character. I hadn't previously seen this painting represented in any of the Ramsay publications available, nor was it exhibited in the recent National Gallery of Australia comprehensive retrospective of January 2020. It has, though, been verified by the artist's niece, Mrs. Patricia Fullerton, who is an expert on Hugh Ramsay's oeuvre. So during the treatment process, I was very curious to know more about the sitter Harley Griffiths, the previous owner and Mr. Percy Thompson, and how they were connected to the artist Hugh Ramsay. With the client's permission, I was able to do a little ancestry digging, some art historical research, and some trove searching to uncover a few details of how their lives intersected. I was also fortuitous to be in Canberra, well, perhaps not so fortuitous, as bushfires were raging everywhere that summer on the eastern seaboard of Australia. But seeing Ramsay's work en masse in the cool confines of our National Gallery was a real treat and provided further clues to the origins of this work. So I've put together this timeline of 3 people whom I researched. I call them the 3 friends, and I've underlined where I know their lives intersected. So starting from the right-hand column is Percy Thompson. I'm afraid I don't have an image of him. He is the great-grandfather of the current owner and was a childhood friend of Ramsay, who lived only a street away from Ramsay's home, Clydebank. Interestingly, the Thompson home has a Scottish name also, Dunoon. So this could be a further heritage connection. Percy Thompson went to school with Ramsay at Essendon Grammar from 1889 to 1891. And in the Argus newspaper of 1889, they are both reported as prize-winning students of that year. I'm still uncertain when the work was acquired by Percy and how, but has been in the family since his lifetime, and it has been inherited by his direct descendants, including Percy's daughter, who lived until the ripe age of 92. So I'm not going to talk too much about Hugh Ramsay, as much has been written about his life story. But the last column is that of Harley Griffiths, and I knew this name, Harley Griffiths, from the history of conservation in Australia, as Harley was one of the early conservators at the National Gallery of Victoria from the 1950s. But the sitter on the beach in the painting with his shirt sleeves rolled up is actually Harley's father, Harley Griffiths Sr., or his correct name full name is Frederick Harley Griffiths, to be precise. So Harley Griffiths, as he was known, was an artist who went to art school with Ramsay from 1894 to 1899. And as you can see by the last entry in the column, his son, Harley Griffiths, who pops up later in the story, as a conservator, and he was actually consulted by the owner's grandmother, the Thompson family, in the late 1960s or 1970s in his job at the National Gallery of Victoria. And it is said that on seeing the painting, his son Harley is quoted as saying, "That's my father in the picture." And it is he, Harley Griffiths, the son, who restored the work. Perhaps he did the mariflaging, perhaps he did some of the overpainting, the damages. So I knew from Fullerton's research, extensive research, that in December 1897, that Ramsay, via correspondence with his father, and I've got the correspondence in the bottom right of the slide, it's documented that he is going to go on a camping trip to Sorrento Beach with fellow National Gallery School students, Harley Griffiths, Norman Carter, and Albert Ennis, and perhaps other friends. So we've got this lovely little bit of correspondence, a letter written to Hugh Ramsay, to his father, who was overseas at the time, saying that they were going to go to Sorrento Beach, do some camping, do some painting with his mates. So looking at the little painting in the Grimwade painting slab, I wondered whether this might date the work I was treating to the same trip of December 1897, which is documented in Ramsay's correspondence. And I think my hunch was confirmed when I saw this work, The Tent, 1897, in the 2020 National Gallery of Australia Hugh Ramsay retrospective, curated by Deborah Hart. So examining the tent closely, I could see the same tonal methods favoured by Ramsay's teacher, Bernard Hall, and later Max Meldrum, but also the high horizon line and the brushwork of the sand area were staggeringly similar in colour and method or technique. So I'd love to place these works in the same time frame, but obviously I still need to further confirmation through archival evidence, perhaps from the archives of the Thompson or the Griffiths family, if it indeed exists. So lastly, I also located a figure study in Ramsay's sketchbook. The sketchbook is purported to be circa 1901, but of course, sketchbooks date over several years. And I haven't yet viewed the original of the sketch yet, but it could be related to Harley Griffiths on Sorrento Beach painting. Certainly there's some sort of similarity in the pose of the sketch and the painting. So, to sum up, it was an absolute privilege to encounter this little painting briefly, and it was returned to the client in early 2020. So the current owner is a young man who works in the boutique alcohol industry here in Melbourne. And when I returned it, I inquired if he had a special spot to hang the restored work. And the client stated, it's going straight to the whiskey tasting room, which he happens to have in his home. Somehow, I thought this was entirely fitting for a painting done many years ago by a young Scots-born man, a student in his halcyon days of summer. Thank you.
Hello everybody, thank you for joining me at this presentation. My name is Andrea Nottage. I work on painting conservation projects at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and I've been doing that for several years now. The title of my talk is Arthur Streeton's Lilies and the Landscape Below. It's a case study where the investigative work of conservation and art history came together to create a new story around a painting that had been previously overlooked. Arthur Streeton is one of Australia's most significant landscape painters, but this is a tall, larger-than-life, still life painting in the collection of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, titled Lilium Auratum, and it is as striking and as alluring as some of his captivating landscapes. It stands at 135 centimetres and is on canvas mariflage to chipboard. I cleaned it in late 2019 for an exhibition at the Art Gallery called Streeton that opened from November 2020 to February 2021. Before treatment, the date attributed to this painting was 1933, from information in Streeton's catalogue of 1935. However, by the end of the treatment, there was a curatorial change of date to circa 1909, based on a few clues in the art historical research. Arthur Streeton returned to London for a second time in 1907, after having spent a couple of profitable years back in Australia selling paintings. He had met Nora Clench, a successful violinist, in 1899 in London, and they married after his return in 1908. Their first child, Oliver, was born the following year. This photograph on the left of 1909 shows a more domestic side of Streeton in his garden, trying to get his dog Pat to sit beside the long-stemmed lilies he was clearly proud of growing. During the time I was cleaning the painting, I was also out with my dog and came across these impressive flowers growing in someone's front garden in my neighbourhood, and I too felt compelled to take a photo. A second interesting image, also dated 1909, is this watercolour on the left. The spray of flowers in the composition is so similar to the lower bunch in the oil painting seen on the right that the chances of Streeton using this idea 23 years later seemed increasingly odd. There was one final clue I will come to later that cemented the curator's final decision. Now I will briefly talk about the treatment. First off, I'd like to say what a great pleasure this painting was to clean. It was one of those treatments that was hugely satisfying. As the non-original layers came away, a dramatic change unfolded before my eyes. Arthur Streeton is known as an exceptional colourist, but before treatment, the colours in this painting didn't have any of the captivating qualities Streeton is so famous for. We were hopeful for a dramatic change in appearance, but not certain. Here it is before treatment on the left and after treatment on the right. Before treatment, the painting looked very dull and flat. The surface was extremely matte, and the green background looked solid. As spectacular as the large flowers were, standing out as the focal point, they didn't have the three-dimensional allure or vibrancy one would expect of Streeton. But after cleaning and revarnishing, these lilies are very prominent, their orange speckles and stamens contrasting against a tonally varied and saturated green background. There were two main layers that came off during cleaning: a top coat, visible to you in this slide on the left side of the painting, with a whitish tide line near the rim of the ginger pot vase. This coating blanched in white spirit, and further cleaning in white spirit removed it. Below that was dark green overpaint in the centre part of this picture, covering the entire background. And the top right corner is an area where the overpaint has been removed and the original green paint is exposed. I opened several small cleaning test windows in various locations across the painting. As I became familiar with the surface, the solubility time of the overpaint, the feel on the swab, and the colour shift between overpaint and original paint, I kept testing more areas, surprised at the extent of the overpaint. Then I went through that slightly frightening thought process of wondering why had it been done? Was there severe damage underneath? What was it hiding? Was it even worth removing? But everything indicated the original paint layer was stable and it was all there. And the colour was also rich and vibrant. I removed the overpaint with propanol. Once my eye was in tune with the two separate layers, the overpaint was thick, dark, and sludgy. And all it seemed to be disguising were drying cracks and age cracks. The original green layer was such a beautiful colour, with brush marks and variations in tone. This gave depth to the composition and was much more in keeping with what one would expect to find in a Streeton painting. Removal of the overpaint also exposed some more interesting details about the painting. There were now lots of visible brush marks and some small areas of impasto that were incongruous to the painting of the lilies. From the centre towards the right side, the occasional bit of yellow paint would be exposed from below the green background, and from the centre towards the left side, some blue would occasionally come through. This detail of the clean surface shows where old minor abrasions to the green paint layer had exposed an underlying blue. Something was definitely lying below the lilies. More evidence that Streeton had painted the lilies directly over another painting was around the edges of some of the flower heads. Here, clear blue paint was left exposed. It's interesting, he didn't feel the need to whitewash the previous image before starting a new one on a clean background, but boldly painted the flowers on directly. You can see in these details the artist's fluid and confident brushstrokes. The petals were evidently applied first, and the green background swiftly contoured around them. So what was under Lilium auratum? The X-ray of the painting rotated 90 degrees shows a complete landscape with a very distinctive mountain range. In fact, there are several paintings by Streeton with known X-ray images of other complete paintings underneath. The Art Gallery of New South Wales have at least two others. A still life titled The Melon, circa 1920, with an image of Tintern Abbey in the United Kingdom below, and Roses, circa 1929, which not only has another vase and flower composition below, but also a 3/4 length portrait. Unfortunately, in the X-ray, the roses obscure the features of the man in the portrait. There are no clear reasons why Streeton did this to his work. He was commercially successful during his lifetime, so lack of money for materials seems unlikely. In the recent exhibition catalogue, the curator quotes from a letter by Streeton in 1918, where he writes, "I just go on with my work, believing in myself, that's all." There is an entry in Streeton's catalogue of 1935 titled Gloucester Buckets Grey, missing, not sold by artist, that matches the dimensions of Lilium auratum exactly. After having earned some money from good sales of paintings in Melbourne and Sydney, in late 1893, Streeton went from Sydney inland to the small New South Wales regional town of Gloucester. He's known to have painted several works in the area, including 2 large canvases of the landscape and mountain ranges in 1894. This painting is titled The Gloucester Buckets, or A.A. Coe's Million Acres, and referred to as Gloucester Buckets Sunny. It was purchased 24 years later by the Art Gallery of New South Wales in 1918, only after Streeton had sent it to both Paris and London to be exhibited, but was unsuccessful in securing a sale at that time. The other painting was titled The A.A. Company's Gloucester Buckets, or referred to as Gloucester Buckets Grey. On the left is an etching of Gloucester Buckets Grey for the catalogue of the 1894 exhibition at the Art Society of New South Wales, where it was shown to great acclaim and was praised for its control of colour and grey tonal sky. Critics liked it for its more conservative style and palette, compared with some of Streeton's earlier successes, where he was painting the bright light and vivid colours around Sydney and Melbourne in his own Australian Impressionist style. However, this painting was unsold by the end of that 1894 exhibition, and by 1935 was noted as missing, not sold by artist. Due to some confusion over the years over the titles attributed to these Gloucester Bucket paintings, you can see from the X-ray of Lilium auratum on the right that Gloucester Buckets Grey has been found and is safely lying below. In this infrared image, you can see exactly where the lilies sit over the landscape. It becomes clear why the blue colour of the mountains was occasionally exposed on the left side of the lilies, and yellow from the golden pasture in the foreground of the landscape broke through old abrasions on the right side of the lilies. It seemed unlikely that if Streeton had painted the lilies in 1933, that only 2 years later, in 1935, he would have forgotten he had painted over Gloucester Buckets Grey and noted it as missing in his catalogue. This was the third piece of information taken into account when deciding to change the attribution date of Lilium auratum to circa 1909. I brought these two paintings together before treatment in the studio, just for the sake of having them side by side. Something that probably hasn't happened in a century. Gloucester Bucket Sunny is on the right, and the knowledge of the presence of Gloucester Buckets Grey on the left. And here they are after treatment. Gloucester Buckets Grey must have been a beautiful painting too, but we'll never know or understand why Streeton painted over it. As a sign of the times, the shop have a new product onto which the image of the lilies can be attached, the all too familiar face mask. But I also include this image because we had to say farewell to Gloucester Buckets Grey, forever below the lilies. Those small areas of old abrasion were glazed out with dry pigment in Aquazole 200 in water, and varnishing was done in MS2A. But now that there is no solid layer of overpaint present, in sharp raking light, you'll always be able to see the distinctive outline of the mountain range running down the left vertical side of the painting, due to the textural difference in Streeton's paint application. And up close, you can still see the underlying blue paint around some of the flower heads. Finally, I would like to end in the exhibition where Lilium auratum hung magnificently on its own wall in the middle of the room, commanding every visitor's attention. Painting conservation is truly the best job when we can bring back focus to a painting that was otherwise considered second-rate or unexhibitable. Thank you all for your attention. One day, when travel seems easy again, if any of you come and visit the Art Gallery of New South Wales, Lilium auratum is now going on permanent display. So as you pass by, you'll be privy to a Streeton secret that not too many other people will know about. In conclusion, I'd just like to thank all the curatorial and conservation staff at the Art Gallery of New South Wales and elsewhere involved in the art historical research and preparation of the Streeton exhibition. I'd also like to acknowledge the Art Gallery's group of conservation benefactors who funded the treatment. Thanks for your attention.
Before we start, we both wanted to thank Kay Lansley for all the information and thoughts that she shared in our informal meetings as anecdotal evidence. We originally were going to base a large portion of this presentation on a face-to-face interview, however could not due to lockdown restrictions. Hi, my name is Lily. Kim and I will discuss the background, condition and treatment of an early Colin Lansley artwork that Kay Lansley brought to the David Stein & Co. studio in 2020 for treatment advice. It was quite an interesting treatment, the work having many structural damages, major collage pieces missing and a borer infestation. Colin Lansley was an Australian painter, sculptor and printmaker. He was known for creating iconic abstract scenes of brightly coloured three-dimensional geometric shapes. He experimented with avant-garde forms of art, building a provocative body of assemblages, collage and junk art, drawing inspiration from the spirit of data, larrikinism and non-Western art, in particular Indigenous Australian art and tribal ornamental decorations of New Guinea. He combined collage and sculpture on a large scale, often consisting of painted wood elements and collage pieces fixed to objects, wooden and canvas supports. In 1962, Lansley, along with his classmates from Sydney Technical College, Mike Brown and Ross Crothall, established the Annandale Imitation Realist School. The artists created collages from scraps and debris they found in urban environments. They were known to meet in wine bars and coffee shops and play aesthetic chess, where Lansley, Brown and Crothall and other artists from the East Sydney Technical College would make impromptu arrangements and collages from everyday objects in their pockets. Altar is a prime example of Lansley's early and formative years, produced while he was part of an Annandale Imitation Realists. Altar is constructed into roughly 4 vertical panels with an assemblage of found objects, including dress fabric, beaded necklaces, children toys, media collage and paint on board. The work takes influence from Bacon and Albert Tucker and is characterized by a random narrative of images that are said to have astounded and confounded audiences when they were exhibited in 1962. The artwork was purchased by Robert Hughes, an Australian art critic, writer and producer. It was rumoured that the artwork travelled to New York with him and it was a prized part of his collection. Whilst in Robert Hughes' ownership, Altar was a part of the travelling solo exhibition Gallery A. Funded by the Australian Government, Gallery A was shown in Sydney in 1965 and travelled to Japan the same year. The exhibition showed a group of dynamic, large-scale freestanding collage and sculptural works from the same period, including Caris from National Gallery of Australia and Phoenix Among the Stars, that's in private collection in Melbourne. When Altar returned to Australia from exhibition, the artwork was in disrepair. Major collage items were missing, including the Calais Centaur slot machine, and the artwork had large areas of impact damage associated with transport. Kay Lansley recalls Colin being devastated. He considered Altar to be part of one of his great art achievements, and now could not bring himself to look at it. The couple put the artwork into storage, Colin both unsure and unwilling to repair the artwork, and there it stayed until 2020. Altar is a large timber construction. Most of the artistically painted surfaces use plywood panels as a support. The paint itself, although a variety of different paint types, it appeared to be mostly commercial industrial paint rather than artist paints. Some of the collage items on the artwork, Kay speculates are from junk shops or cheap thrift stores, or simply just found objects. The objects range from paper collage, glass bead clothing, wooden, metal and plastic toys, to glasses frames and a bicycle seat. Whatever their individual origins, they represent a range of children's toys and other objects that are typical to a certain area in Sydney and perhaps the rest of Australia. Most of the children toy elements appear to represent fairground or Easter agricultural show toys. The Calais Brothers gambling machine at the centre of the artwork is a significant historical item in its own right. Judging by images of other works dating from the same time period, parts of Calais Centaur machine have been utilised in other Lansley works. The way that Lansley found the gambling machine is quite a humorous story and points to the way that Colin was creating most of his artworks at the time, with found materials and items that were significant to him personally. Kay mentioned, again, our discussions were informal, that he had seen the gambling machine in someone's back garden while travelling past on a bus. He got off the bus and walked back and asked if he could take or possibly purchase the machine. The owners refused the offer. Not deterred, Lansley later returned, perhaps with fellow artists, to steal the Calais Centre machine from the owner's yard. When Alta was delivered to the David Stein & Co. studio from where it had been stored, it was immediately obvious that the storage environment was not museum standard. The artwork had numerous structural damages from impact, borer infestation, some collage items had significantly aged, and it had a heavy layer of dust and grime. There were major damages and losses to the collage components of the artwork. The centrepiece of the work, the Calais Centre slot machine, was missing, as well as a children's propeller toy and small plastic forks. Some objects had deteriorated with age, such as the orange balloon at the top of the left panel, the bicycle seat in the centre panel, and the corrosion of the metal plate in the remaining components of the Calais Centre slot machine. Overall, the artwork presented impact damages, paint loss, water staining, minor scuffs and abrasion to throughout the artwork and frame, and required an involved conservation treatment. The outer frame of the artwork had taken the brunt of many knocks and scratches, and as a result was heavily dented in some areas and missing quite a lot of the original paint.
Hi, I'm Kim. I undertook most of the practical treatment on Lansley's Alta. For me, it was a very interesting and unusual treatment, so I'd like to share with you how we decided on our treatment path and the steps involved in completing it. Kay Lansley was very influential in this treatment. She was dismayed about the condition of the artwork in her initial discussions with David Stein. She mentioned to David that there was an artwork in storage that she was considering taking to Tempe Tip because of its condition, but she would like David to give his opinion on it first. Needless to say, David was emphatic about the need to bring such an important early work into the studio for conservation. Kay is the custodian of much of Colin's work, and following her discussions with David, intended this piece to be a major part of a retrospective happening at NAS later this year, or maybe next year, whenever the rescheduled time is. She mentioned that the conservation of the artwork had become very important to her and to the memory of Colin, because it arrived back from the travelling exhibition in such poor condition, and Colin was very upset about its condition when it returned. Some of the key elements for this artwork were missing when it returned, and some of it needed actual restoration. So important discussions were held to decide whether the gambling machine plate should be replaced. If so, how might that be achieved in order for it to work aesthetically within the artwork and in line with Colin's original intention. It was also decided that several of the relatively small sculptural collage elements were integral to the narrative being told by the artwork, as well as the overall composition. Kay provided a photo of the artwork from not long after it was completed. The photo was from a calendar which appears to be commemorating the artworks of the travelling exhibition that went to Japan. The calendar photo was very useful in seeing the original condition of the artwork, despite the colours being quite washed out, the blurring of the photo and those kind of things. But however, we could see what Colin had intended for the work. The first treatment step and most pressing problem was an active borer infestation. The artwork was sealed in plastic film for a set period of time and kept at a set temperature. The challenging part of the pest treatment was that the artwork was so large and therefore heavy and had many very delicate, broken and or fragile elements. Following the successful pest treatment, the artwork was brush vacuumed and aqueously cleaned with pH 8 buffered solution with 0.5% DTP8 chelating agent, followed by an enzymatic solution to remove the many decades worth of dirt and dust buildup on the surface of the artwork and to treat suspected mould. Dry cleaning methods were also employed in sensitive areas where aqueous cleaning was not appropriate. We ended up cleaning this a couple of times because it was filthy. At this point, in-depth research was undertaken into the missing coin return plate of the Kale Centaur gambling machine. Simply purchasing a replacement plate from the same model would be nearly impossible to achieve, we found, and would be prohibitively expensive, and also raised some ethical issues surrounding using a single part from another cultural artefact. Instead, detailed photographs were supplied to Attila Inhofe, a frame restorer, who undertook to carve a replica piece out of timber. The replica was gilded and patinated to match the remaining metal parts of the KL Centaur gambling machine. Whilst the replacement coin return plate for the KL Centaur was being carved, we undertook some other structural repairs. A timber patch was applied at verso of the major puncture to the support at lower left, and the hole filled with an appropriate timber filler for inpainting later in the treatment. Two small panels that had been broken and misaligned were also secured back in place. Consolidation around damaged areas was undertaken with either Lasco 498 HV or Plexol B500, or a combination of the two. Lasco 498 HV utilised for its high viscosity and Plexol B500 for its relatively low viscosity, with both materials remaining thermoplastic for manipulation with a heat pen or heated spatula later on. Paper collage items were flattened with humidity, heat, and either clamping or with magnetic weights. A series of Dentasil and Milliput moulds were made from the fork adhesive impressions still present in the artwork. A tinted Hextile epoxy resin was poured into the mould to cure, and the aged powdery appearance of old plastic was achieved with acrylic resin and pigments dusted or rubbed into the surface. Elements such as missing fan or helicopter toy components in the lower right quadrant were repaired with brass plate. The aged plastic patina was achieved in the same way as with the forks, with acrylics and pigments. In-painting was conducted in areas of impact-induced losses, flaking paint and borer holes, primarily with Gamelin conservation colours mixed with limonene and Laripal A81 to regulate gloss. The frame of the artwork contains splashes and marks original to the artwork. Therefore, recent dents and losses to the frame were filled and retouched with gouache. The easily removable gouache was cleaned off any original paint splashes and then covered with a layer of Regal Res 1094 in Shelsol D40, a finish that remarkably reproduces the original paint whilst remaining durable and fully reversible. This interesting treatment involved multiple difficult decision-making steps, which would not be possible without cooperation between the custodian, conservators, and a skilled artisan. Discussions with Kay Lansley around the artist's intent for the work and on the important treatment paths were of enormous value to the conservation of the work, and without which it may have led to a very different outcome. The successful treatment of Alta has allowed an important early work from Colin Lansley's oeuvre and from Australian art history to be shown once again on public display. We also had to bear in mind that when it was exhibited in Lansley's retrospective show, it would help to tell of the origins of Lansley's career. And in that part of the planned exhibition is that art critic John McDonald will write a piece on Lansley centred on the conservation of this work. Lastly, we are very proud to say that Kay was thrilled with the conservation and commented that it's great that we didn't make it look new, meaning that the reconstructed parts fit with the age of the rest of the work and completed the narrative of the piece once again. We thank you for listening, and if you have any questions for us, we look forward to speaking to you soon.
Before beginning today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Hello everyone, my name is Madeline Ewing and today I'm presenting the conservation of a termite damaged acrylic painting, innovative solutions for the treatment of Gordon Bennett's No. 3. This collaborative major treatment was undertaken at Quagoma throughout 2020 and formed a significant part of a 12-month graduate internship in paintings conservation I completed during that time, where I was working alongside senior paintings conservators Anne Carter and Gillian Osmond. The project was undertaken in preparation for Unfinished Business, The Art of Gordon Bennett, hosted at GOMA, and a major retrospective of the late artist's work. Treatment for number 3 was made possible with support from Gordon Bennett's estate, in particular Gordon's wife, Leanne Bennett, whom I gratefully acknowledge from the outset. I'm going to dive right in because there's lots to talk about. This is the work in question, number 3, a significant diptych painted in acrylic on linen belonging to the Artist Stripe series, where he explored Western abstractionism. The diptych shows a rectilinear composition where lines seamlessly converge across panels to produce a reverse chevron effect at viewing distance, each panel being a mirror image of its counterpart. There's a real emphasis on materiality, which is visible in the dry, flat brushwork characteristic of acrylic emulsion paints, as well as the decision to leave the works deliberately unvarnished. In 2014, the left panel sustained significant termite damage. The paintings were housed in a secure, temperature-controlled steel and concrete storage facility in Brisbane, but unfortunately the termite stealth was matched only by their determinedness, and they entered the building through a wooden expansion joint in the concrete flooring, then worked their way through the painting's fully enclosed bubble wrap to feast on the timber stretcher and any canvas or paint in their path. This was promptly discovered in just a matter of days and appropriately managed, so thankfully no other works were affected, not even the partner panel, which was wrapped separately for storage. This is a real testament to the care and vigilance of Bennett's estate and collection managers, and I think shines a light on some of the external risks specific to collections in tropical and subtropical climates like Queensland, and proves that even the most scrupulously cared for works aren't immune from the threat of infestation. As for the damage that was sustained, however, it was significant and had pretty serious structural and visual consequences. The termites very efficiently tunnelled their way around the timber stretcher and continued tunnelling right through the perimeter margins of the work. So structural integrity was heavily compromised. The stretcher members had actually collapsed inwards in several areas, so those original fold lines were completely distorted. There were also significant surface distortions. The wet termite mud trapped behind the canvas had acted as a sort of hygroscopic poultice over time, so right around the perimeter were these unsightly bulges and planar deformations that were locked in place as that mud dried. You can see here the gaping holes in the painted canvas. There were also metres of termite mud deposited on the front and back surfaces. All of these issues were further complicated by the unique sensitivities of unvarnished modern acrylic paintings, which can often make them incompatible with more traditional conservation materials and techniques. So this is what we're up against, and in forming our treatment aims, we had 3 primary objectives: to re-establish structural stability for both the canvas and stretcher supports, to minimise the appearance of any surface disruptions or planar deformations detracting from that rectilinear composition, and to aesthetically reintegrate all areas of damage and loss. And because we were preparing for a specific exhibition, each of these objectives was resolved with the express purpose of achieving a displayable condition. Of course, that's something we couldn't have been sure of in the beginning. We were definitely in uncharted waters, and all we could be certain of was there was going to be a lot of problem solving, experimenting, and thinking outside the box no matter what approach we chose, and this was certainly true. So what did that look like? Treatment began with cleaning the work, and this started on the front with removing the mud from the painter's surface, and that was quite a difficult task. Aqueous cleaning tests did show the mud was hygroscopic but incredibly durable. I guess, thinking about ancient termite mounds, it's almost cement-like. It's such a durable material by nature. So the addition of chelators, surfactants, and other cleaning agents really achieved little success, as did gelling those cleaning solutions with extended and repeated applications. We found the mud needed to be in near constant contact with free-flowing solvent, in this case water adjusted to pH 5.5, and then each layer was carefully scraped away with bamboo skewers and fine surgical tools. Naturally, this was done working in quite small sections, so it was a painstaking process given the amount of mud on the painted surface. This step alone took several weeks to complete. So next, the perimeter and visible tacking margins were faced with Japanese tissue, and then the work was turned over to begin cleaning on the back. You can see there was considerable mud packed between the canvas and stretcher, which had fused the two together. We used pallet knives to separate them, remove the staples, and then could lift the damaged stretcher away. The compromised edges precluded the use of a working loom in this instance, so central weights were placed in the absence of tension. Mud build-up on the back was extensive. The entire perimeter was soiled, with a mud line varying in width from 3 to 12 centimetres. And the bulk of these accretions were mechanically reduced with blunt scalpels while dry. You can see here in this before and after that some staining did remain visible, and there were residues trapped in the interstices of the canvas weave, which required softening with moisture for further removal. So in this way, further cleaning of the back of the work and flattening those perimeter distortions occurred simultaneously. Vapor humidification tests for edge distortions, so using damp blotter through Tyvek, were generally unsuccessful and showed it was better to work in smaller, more controlled areas. So we developed a targeted approach where moisture was directly applied with a cotton swab. This then softened those mud residues, which could be carefully scraped away. So again, working in small sections, roughly 4 by 4 centimetres, this was repeated 2 to 3 times in the same area before being placed under dry weights overnight. We also made sure to weight adjacent areas to limit dimensional change in the unstretched canvas, and this precluded working on areas directly next to one another. So the perimeter was worked in a sort of checkerboard pattern, starting at the centre of each side and working our way out to adjacent corners. Heavily distorted areas like corners did need repeated applications, but as you can see here in this before and after raking light image, the difference was quite dramatic and the method successful overall. Loss compensation was really our biggest challenge in this treatment, not just because the scale of loss was so big, but because of the materials. The sensitivities of the unvarnished surface and also the aesthetic qualities, those uninterrupted passages of flat, matte, black paint, it was a particularly unforgiving surface to be working directly with. So we'd predicted fairly early in the piece that more conventional approaches for filling were not likely to be suitable. And for this reason, we conducted numerous experiments to trial a range of different approaches. Invaluable to this process was a scaled mock-up of the damaged panel, which you can see me making here. And this was done using Bennett's original studio paints, which were generously made available by Leanne Bennett for our use. And I really can't stress enough just how invaluable this tool was for problem solving with different materials. This mock-up was used to solve approaches for filling, for strip lining and in-painting right throughout the treatment, and also gave us a greater insight into Bennett's materials and practice, which was ultimately the key to success in the end. But filling first, in addition to the scaled mock-up, I painted out a number of other canvas samples and cut out holes to replicate the termite damage so that we could trial different filling approaches. So conventionally, when we think about filling, it's something that's done working from the front. And generally speaking, this requires a certain amount of overfilling, followed by levelling off, shaping and texturing. Tests showed this was not viable for number 3, however, as it led to ghosting, tide lines and a whole range of other clearance issues. For the larger losses, some were as large as 10 centimetres squared, fabric inserts needing further application of fill putty to integrate those join lines were excluded for similar reasons. We did consider leaving losses unfilled, but visually reduced with a pigmented interleaf, but shadows cast by a change in depth we felt unacceptably compromised the painting's visual aesthetic, so that option was out too. The real kicker though was what we found when we turned the work over, and this was the termite's selective consumption of materials. So obviously they were eating the timber stretcher, but also the cellulose-rich canvas fibres. So what we found when we turned the work over were these areas of paint where the termites had burst through the tunnels, eaten the canvas, and then stopped when they'd got to the paint. And what remained were these intact but entirely unsupported paint fragments. So we knew that loss compensation was going to start with filling from the back to reinforce those fragments. And I guess we then started thinking, okay, we're working from the back. There are some serious issues and sensitivities with the front. What if we kept working from the back? And this is where we developed a new back filling technique. And in this technique, the facing tissue acts as a barrier and creates a three-dimensional space in which filling putty can be applied and levelled from the reverse. So in theory, if your facing tissue has good contact with the lost perimeter at the front, then a neat and level fill can be achieved without disrupting the original paint surface, which is protected from overfilling and any associated clearance issues. The location of the losses on number 3 did complicate things. Being around the perimeter, backfilling had to be done before restretching because the stretcher and planned strip lining materials would have precluded access from the back. So reversing the sequencing here required brand new performance characteristics from the filling material. The losses were either very close to or extended over fold lines, so they needed to be flexible enough to withstand the stresses of restretching. Up to this point, and because of the materials we'd been favouring the use of water-soluble fill binders, we found good success with the backfills by loading cellulose fibres into methyl cellulose, for instance. But this, along with other traditional materials like chalk and gelatin or proprietary filling putties, were much too brittle for this application. After many weeks of testing, we formulated a filling putty using cellulose fibres and Evasol, an ethylene vinyl acetate copolymer adhesive specifically developed for book and paper conservation in Australia. Now, the manufacturers claim that the minimal vinyl acetate in Evasol lessens its susceptibility to acid hydrolysis over time. We did reach out for more information around monomer ratio content, but unfortunately they were unable to provide us with that information. So while we know the product formulation reduces the risk, the formation of acetic acid as a result of vinyl acetate degradation is a concern for the long-term stability of the Evasol binder. However, in this instance, it was by far the most suitable and safe material for use in this context. Stress tests for Evasol cellulose fills had excellent flexibility and showed a good resilience to stretching. And in doing so, it made the backfilling method viable, which meant the delicate original surface was not at all disrupted throughout structural treatment. So the process itself. The fills were dried under weights to limit shrinkage, and this presented an opportunity to impart texture by impression. Leanne Bennett was able to supply an unused canvas from Bennett's studio that closely matched the weave of number 3, and this was used as the impression canvas, which you can see here. Warp and weft threads were lined up as closely as possible for a seamless effect. This was done by just slightly wetting the facing tissue until it was just transparent, and then a set square could be used to line up the warp and weft threads from the original and the impression canvas. For fill application, this was done using a micro spatula, as you can see, and the perimeter was filled first to ensure good edge contact at the front. The putty did have a slightly tacky consistency, so this was gently levelled with a fingertip, working over a barrier of silicone release before placing under weights to dry. Larger losses were tackled in sections and over several days to limit shrinkage. So stress tests on mock-ups replicating larger losses showed this approach had no negative effect on fill cohesion across wider surface areas. The join lines were stable, and so long as the impression canvas remained in place, fill texture was coherent from the front. To aid in this process, large batches of filling putty were hand mixed and stored in plastic syringes, which had a shelf life of around 4 or 5 days. This is significant because it ensured greater consistency across individual fills. It meant multiple conservators could be applying fills with the same fill binder ratio at once, and was generally just a great time and waste saving measure. So here are some images of the dry fills viewed from the front, and these raking light shots before facing removal give a good sense of the texture that was imparted throughout weighted drying. For lining, thankfully we could avoid a full-scale lining. The damage really was restricted to the edges of the work. We chose a medium weight Stable Tex and Beaver film for strip lining. And ideally we would have liked to use something stiffer like sailcloth to reinforce the weakened edges, but the lining material had to extend into the image plane to support the fills, and tests on the mock-up showed it was difficult to achieve crisp leading edge folds with a stiffer fabric, so Stapletex we found to be a good middle ground in this instance. You can see in the right image here that the corners were isolated using L-shaped sections, and this was to avoid creating potential points of weakness in critically damaged areas. So once the painting was strip lined, it was ready for restretching, and obviously the original was damaged well beyond repair. So for the new stretcher, we sourced an unused one of the same size and make from Bennett's studio. This ensured consistency with its partner panel, which was significant. We worked closely with Alex Forrest, pictured here, Quagoma's conservation framing technician, who replaced the bottom stretcher member with a custom shaped piece to account for the heavily distorted original fold line. And these had to be maintained because they represent the limit of the original painted image. So the work was pinned to the stretcher several times, and with great patience, Alex carved into the timber to create the shape we needed. We knew we couldn't go too crazy though, because the panel is one part of a diptych that relies on the convergence of lines across both. But in the end, each member was hand planed and modified in some way. We also stapled through polyethylene tape, so we could reuse the original staple holes where feasible. Moving on to in-painting, the Evasol cellulose fills provided a surprisingly favourable working surface for retouching. You might expect the surface to be quite plastic compared to more traditional fills, but water-soluble retouching paints took to the surface really well. Dry pigments and Aquazol 500 were used to replicate matte black paint with good results, as you can see here. The white paint was more difficult. Achieving suitable opacity, brightness and body for the moderate impasto brushwork was eventually solved by loading titanium white pigment into 40% Aquazol 50 in water, and getting a consistency with enough body to retain its shape on drying meant the retouching paint was quite viscous, so we used 20 to 80 ethanol in water as the retouching diluent for ease of application. This is number 3 post-treatment and on display in Unfinished Business last year. It did make it into the show in the end, and the work was actually acquired by Quagoma as a gift of Leanne Bennett. So this case study highlights some of the conservation issues posed by contemporary paintings and demonstrates how the particular sensitivities of acrylic emulsion paints can be incompatible with conventional conservation materials and techniques. Problem solving for number 3 required thinking outside the box at every stage to find materials and methods uniquely suited to this application and unique damage type. Support from Bennett's estate, in particular from Leanne, was a major key to success. The studio materials generously donated were crucial in resolving structural and aesthetic treatment issues, and also allowed for a greater understanding of Bennett's materials and practice. In closing, I'd like to thank first and foremost Anne Carter and Gillian Osmond for their unwavering support and encouragement, not just throughout this project, but for my entire time spent at Quagoma and beyond. Thank you also to Leanne Bennett for her trust and support throughout the treatment project. The studio materials she donated really were the key to success here. And final thanks to Ray and Raymonda and the rest of the AICCM team for making this the first virtual paintings forum possible. It's such a great way to connect with peers in bizarre and challenging times, and I look forward to hearing any questions you might have. Thank you.